3 long days had passed since my husband left for his business trip, and the house felt unusually silent. The air was heavy with an unsettling calm, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. My 2 sons, Liam and Jake, were at home with me, but their presence couldn't fill the void left by their father. Liam, at 33, was the responsible one. He had always been more mature than his years, a rock in our family. He handled everything, making sure everything ran smoothly, and had a way of making even the most mundane tasks seem manageable. But Jake was different. At just 21, he was still figuring out who he was, and it showed in the way he behaved. That morning, I couldn't help but notice how much Jake had changed. He had recently turned 21, and it felt like overnight, he had transformed into a surprisingly attractive young man. His body had toned up and looked athletic, the result of countless hours in the gym. He walked with a renewed confidence, his broad shoulders and straight posture. I had always seen him as my little one, but now I began to see him as a man who was undeniably attractive in ways I never expected. It was truly shocking. I was so wrapped up in my daily routines, taking care of the house and my family, that I hadn't realized how quickly he had grown. One minute he was my sweet, awkward boy, and the next he was standing in front of me, radiating an energy that made it hard to concentrate. I caught myself staring at him more than I meant to, my heart pounding as I realized how much he had changed, not just physically, but emotionally too. While Liam continued with his usual tasks, helping me around the house and checking everything, Jake seemed to linger in my space a little longer. His playful chatter had a deeper undertone, something charged, that unsettled me but also excited me. I didn't want to admit it, but there was an attraction between us that I couldn't ignore. It was as if the absence of my husband had created a void that Jake, unknowingly, was trying to fill, and I found myself both fascinated and terrified by the idea. As the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in our dynamic. Jake was no longer just my son. He was a young man standing on the threshold of adulthood, filled with desires and thoughts I wasn't prepared to confront. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden rays through the kitchen window as we prepared lunch. I watched him chopping vegetables, his muscles flexing beneath his t-shirt, and for a brief moment I lost myself in my thoughts. I couldn't help but admire how capable he had become, how much he had taken on. Still, there was a line I feared we might cross. It was a strange feeling running down my spine, both exciting and confusing. I wanted to guide him, protect him, but at the same time, I could feel the electricity in the air, the unspoken words hanging between us. The day had only just begun, and already the tension felt almost unbearable. The next day dawned with an unsettling light, as if amplifying the tension in the air. My husband still hadn't returned, and as I sat in the kitchen sipping my coffee, I could feel a strange anticipation bubbling beneath the surface. Liam had already gone to work, leaving Jake and me alone in the house. It felt strangely quiet, as if the walls were listening to the unspoken thoughts floating between us. Jake had planned to spend the afternoon with friends, but something about the way he lingered in the house made me think he wasn't ready to leave just yet. I found him lounging on the couch, a video game controller in hand, but his focus seemed to waver from time to time. Every time he looked at me, there was something in his eyes I couldn't identify, and my heart raced when we exchanged glances, a magnetic attraction that sent shivers down my spine. As I moved around the kitchen, picking up the breakfast dishes, I saw him watching me. He was reclining on the couch, his gaze intense, almost studying me. There was an intensity in his look that made my skin tingle, and I had to remind myself that he was still my son, no matter how different everything felt. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was starting to see me as something more than his mother, and that both excited and terrified me. "Mom, do you want to play a game?" he asked, his voice casual, but with an undertone that hinted at something deeper. I hesitated for a moment. The invitation hung in the air like a challenge. Part of me wanted to turn him down to keep things normal and simple, but another part of me, the part that had been electrified by his presence, wanted to say yes. I could feel the inner struggle within me. "Maybe later," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady as I turned to tend to the dishes, attempting to hide the heat rising in my cheeks. I could feel his gaze lingering, as if the air around us had thickened. I could sense his movement, and when I finally dared to look at him again, he was standing, walking toward me with a confidence that took my breath away. "Mom," he said, his tone now serious, "can we talk?" The words hung heavy in the air. I nodded slowly, the knot in my stomach tightening. He moved closer, and I could feel the heat radiating from him. A physical reminder of how he had transformed into this incredibly attractive man. It was overwhelming and I found myself speechless. He stopped a few feet away from me, his eyes searching mine for something, but I didn't know what to give him. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about how things have changed," he said, his voice low. "It feels different between us, you know?" My breath stopped. I was scared, terrified of where this conversation might lead, but I also felt an attraction toward him, an inexplicable connection that pulled me in. "I know it's strange, but I can't help what I feel," he continued, moving even closer, closing the distance between us. My heart pounded as he reached out, brushing my arm, and the touch sent a jolt through me. It was innocent, but the way he looked at me, the way his breath caught, sparked something inside me that I had never allowed myself to acknowledge. "Jake," I started, my voice trembling. I could feel the tension tightening around us like a spring. "This isn't right, we have to be careful." The words came out hurriedly, trying to create some boundary, but deep down, I could feel a part of me wanting to give in, to explore this connection that had unexpectedly arisen between us. He stopped, and for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. "I just thought maybe we could be more than what we are," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't want to hide what I feel anymore." My heart was racing, caught in a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't process. The line between mother and son was blurring, and it was terrifying to confront it. "I love you, Jake, but you're my son," I managed to say, trying to restore some normalcy to our dynamic. "We can't cross that line, it's not right." But as I spoke to him, I realized how fragile my own boundaries felt. The tension between us was palpable, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. He desired me, but he also wanted to respect me. I could feel the struggle between us, a battle of desires neither of us knew how to handle. The next day arrived heavy with the silence left by yesterday's conversation. My husband was still absent, and the tension with Jake felt like a storm that was brewing. I focused on lunch, trying to push the thoughts of him away. When Liam came home early, a sense of relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by the weight of Jake's presence. Liam chatted about his day, and I tried to focus, but Jake's proximity was magnetic. When Jake reached for a snack, our arms brushed, sending a jolt through me. It was wrong, but it felt so good. My heart raced when Liam stepped out to make a call, leaving me alone with Jake. "Mom, can we talk?" he asked, urgency in his voice. Panic shot through me. I wanted to deny it, but he was so close, and I could feel the electricity in the air between us. "Please listen to me," he said, desperation in his eyes. "Jake, we can't," I began, but he moved closer, the intensity radiating from him. "This doesn't have to be wrong." As the night wore on, I tried to shake the unsettling feelings that clung to me like fog. Dinner was an exercise in normalcy. I wanted to focus on Liam's stories about work and keep the conversation light, but my mind kept drifting back to Jake. The tension from before still lingered, as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. After dinner, I suggested watching a movie, hoping to distract us. Liam eagerly agreed, but Jake remained quiet, his gaze fixed on me. I settled into the couch, trying to act casual, but Jake chose to sit right beside me. The couch felt smaller, and with every passing moment, I could feel the heat radiating from him, a magnetic attraction I was struggling to resist. As the movie played, I felt Jake's eyes on me, watching me with an intensity that made my heart race. Every time I laughed or moved, I could feel his attention sharpening. It was unsettling but intoxicating. I couldn't ignore how much he had changed, how the young man beside me was no longer just my son, but someone who had become incredibly attractive, both physically and emotionally. "Mom," he said softly, his voice cutting through the dim light of the screen. "I can't stop thinking about yesterday." I held my breath, knowing that this conversation would take us to a dangerous place. What if we explore this, whatever it is between us, even just a little? I turned to look at him, my heart pounding. "Jake, we can't. You know this isn't right. You're my son," but even as I said it, a part of me wanted to say yes, to give in to the moment. His expression was sincere, searching my face for a glimmer of hope, a sign that maybe I felt the same. The movie continued to play, but I wasn't watching anymore. My pulse quickened when Jake moved a little closer, the distance between us shrinking. I could smell his cologne, something fresh and clean, and a chill ran down my spine. My instincts screamed at me to pull away, but my body betrayed me, caught in the intense wave of emotion and attraction. "Mom, please," he said, his eyes pleading. "I feel something real here, something that could be more than just mother and son." His honesty made me dizzy. I didn't want to hurt him, but I couldn't shake the reality of our situation. The intensity in his gaze was both thrilling and terrifying. In that moment, I knew I had to set a boundary, but it felt like trying to push against a rising tide. I needed to proceed carefully, to find a way to protect us both from the dangerous thin ice we were walking on. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. "We need to talk about this, Jake, but not here, not now. I don't want to hurt you, but we can't ignore the line we're crossing." As the credits started to roll, I felt a mix of relief and anxiety wash over me. I had managed to redirect the conversation, but I could feel the unresolved tension hanging between us, thick and unbreakable. How do you tell your son you love him, but not the way he wants? How do you maintain the bond while setting boundaries that seem to slip through my fingers? The night felt heavier, charged with an energy I wasn't ready to face, but I knew we had to find a way to navigate this maze together. That night I barely slept, my thoughts racing like a runaway train. Jake's words echoed in the silence of my room, relentless and disturbing. I tossed and turned, trying to convince myself it was just a phase, a misguided crush that would fade with time. But deep down, I knew it was something more complicated than that. The intensity of our connection had changed, and it was impossible to ignore. The next morning, I decided to face the day with normalcy. I put on my favorite sweater and made a big breakfast, hoping the smell of bacon and eggs would lift the heavy atmosphere that had settled in our house. Liam was the first to come downstairs, still half asleep, and smiled as he devoured his food. "This is just what I needed, Mom. You always know how to make everything better," he said, and for a moment I felt relief seeing his smile. I needed to hold on to these moments of normalcy. When Jake came downstairs, his expression was indescribable. He looked at me, and I could feel the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. "Hey, I made breakfast," I said, trying to keep my tone light, though I could hear the slight tremor in my voice. I needed to get through this day without addressing what had happened, at least until I could decide what to do. Liam talked about his plans for the day, completely unaware of the tension lurking beneath the surface. Jake, however, stayed silent, pushing his food around his plate. It broke my heart to see him like this. He had always been such an animated child, full of energy and mischief, but now there was a shadow over him that I couldn't understand. After breakfast, I suggested we take a walk around the neighborhood, hoping the fresh air would clear our minds. As we walked, I could feel Jake's energy fluctuating. He glanced at me out of the corner of his eye, then looked away, as though he was battling an internal conflict. I decided it was time to address things. "Jake," I started, my heart racing as we walked. "I know yesterday was complicated." He stopped, turning to face me, the sun reflecting the intensity in his eyes. "Mom, I don't want to pretend this doesn't matter. I can't ignore it." I took a deep breath, my heart pounding. "I know, but we need to set some boundaries. I love you and I always will, but this, what you're feeling, it's not something we can act on. I'm your mother, and this is our family." His expression faltered, disappointment crossing his face. "Why not? Why can't we just explore this?" "Doesn't feel wrong, Mom. Feels right." "I know, Jake, but we have to think about the bigger picture. I don't want to ruin what we have. I don't want to hurt you, but crossing this line could change everything." He took a step back, frustration evident in his posture. "You're making it sound like I'm some kind of freak. I just want to understand why it feels like this." I reached out, wanting to comfort him, but I knew I couldn't cross that line. "You're not a freak, Jake. You're growing up and sometimes those feelings get confused. It's natural, but that doesn't mean we should act on them." We stood in silence, the distance between us palpable, filled with emotions neither of us wanted to name. I felt my heart break a little more with each passing second, realizing how complicated love can be. "Let's take some time, okay? Time to think about what this means for both of us. I promise I'll always be here for you no matter what." He nodded, but the pain in his eyes was unmistakable. I wanted to reach out, close the gap, But I couldn't, not now, not when everything felt so fragile. We continued walking, but the air was thick with tension, the unspoken words floating around us like an ominous cloud, reminding me of the complexities of love and the lines we were desperately trying to navigate. I knew we needed to find a resolution, but the way forward felt more uncertain than ever. The tension from our walk hung in the air like a heavy fog. That night, when the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over our house, I knew we needed to have another conversation. The day had passed in a blur, each moment dragging as I replayed our previous interactions in my mind. The weight of the unsaid words pressed on my chest. Jake had retreated into himself, spending most of the day in his room, while Liam filled the space with his innocent chatter, oblivious to the storm brewing between his brother and me. I could see the worry etched on Liam's face every time he looked at Jake's closed door, and my heart broke for both of them. I didn't want this to tear our family apart. I wanted us to stay whole, but the question was how? As the evening settled in, I found myself alone in the kitchen, staring at the pot of soup simmering on the stove, my mind far away. The sound of Jake's footsteps approaching the kitchen brought me back to reality. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, his eyes locked onto mine as if he was waiting for me to speak. I knew I couldn't keep avoiding this conversation. I had to address it for both of our sakes. The silence was unbearable, and the longer I let it linger, the harder it would be to set things right. I put down the spoon and wiped my hands on the towel, turning to face him. Jake, we can't keep dancing around this. I'm your mother. You are my son. That's the way it has to be. His face hardened. But I feel like you're pushing me away. You don't even try to understand what I'm going through. It's like you're treating me like I'm wrong for feeling this way. I felt a pang of guilt shoot through me, but I knew I couldn't give in. I do understand, Jake. But sometimes feelings can be confusing. You're going through a lot of changes, and I'm here for you, but there are lines we can't cross. His jaw clenched. Why? Why can't we just be together? His voice cracked at the last word, a mixture of pain and desperation, and I could see the turmoil inside him. I reached for his hand, but he pulled away before I could touch him. I can't explain it in a way that would make sense to you right now, Jake. But we both know this isn't something we should act on. Not now. Not ever. The words stung more than I expected. I watched his expression crumble, his eyes welling with tears that he tried to hide. My heart shattered. I wanted so badly to take it all back, to say something that would make him feel better, but I knew I couldn't. Jake, please. This is about protecting us, our family. I love you. I'll always love you, but we can't go down this path. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension was thick, the weight of the conversation hanging between us like an invisible force. Finally, Jake nodded, though it was clear he didn't understand, didn't agree. He turned and walked away, retreating to his room. I sat down at the kitchen table, my hands shaking as I tried to process everything that had just happened. What had I done wrong? Had I failed him as a mother? This situation was breaking me apart in ways I hadn't even imagined, but I knew I had made the right choice. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. The next few days passed in a blur of awkward silences and tense moments. Jake and I barely spoke, and I found myself walking on eggshells around him, afraid of saying the wrong thing. Liam continued to be his usual self, unaware of the storm raging just beneath the surface. It wasn't until a few days later, when Jake approached me again, that I felt like we could finally have a real conversation. He looked different, more composed, but there was still a sadness in his eyes that I couldn't ignore. Mom, he started, his voice steady but low, I've been thinking. I know you're right. This isn't something we can do. I didn't understand it at first, but I get it now. It's just hard. I felt the relief wash over me, but also a sense of deep sadness. I could see the pain in his face, but I also saw the acceptance in his eyes. I'm so sorry, Jake, I said, my voice breaking. I never wanted to hurt you. I just want you to know that no matter what, you're my son and I love you. Nothing will ever change that. He nodded, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world had been lifted from him. I love you too, Mom. That night I sat in my room, thinking about everything that had transpired. The emotional toll it had taken on both of us was undeniable, but we had made it through. I had set the boundaries, and while it had been excruciating, it had been necessary for both of us to heal. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy. It would take time for the wounds to fully heal, for the awkwardness to fade, and for our relationship to find a new normal. But I knew that we had the strength to get through it together. And that, despite everything, I had done the right thing.